Good morning, everyone. Sorry for a slight few minutes of delay, everybody. Thank you for joining the ESN Cleer's FY22 annual general meeting. Today's AGM is a virtual online meeting with the use of the Zoom platform, as we are very familiar with these days. My name is Johnny Feng, ESN Cleer's company secretary, and I'll be the facilitator for this virtual AGM. As you have received, the notice of the meeting has included the Zoom access details. There are no proxies necessary, as there are no voting required for the business of the meeting. It is now just after 10 a.m. and we have a quorum. The meeting has opened. Today we have our members of the board in attendance. Professor Andrew Coates, Chair of the Board. Leo De Bruin, CEO and Exec Director. Matt McNamara, Non-Exec Director. Johnny Feng, myself, COO and Exec Director. Jules de Lassonfeld, Non-Exec Director. And we also have Hayley Milburn from RSM, our external auditors, joining us today. And I just saw her online. I'll just double check there. Welcome.
Morning.
Welcome. Morning. And a few notes on today's meeting before we begin the business of the day. All attendees can watch a live broadcast, which you are now, of the meeting, while the meeting is also being recorded. The recording will also be shared to everybody after the meeting. We have a number of questions already received from our shareholders. Attendees to the meeting can also ask questions during the session with a Q&A box. Both will be addressed during the Q&A section towards the end of the meeting. To ask questions, click on the Q&A speech bubble to open the dialog box to submit relevant questions. The questions are collated and will be addressed at the Q&A session towards the end of the meeting. Questions may be moderated, or if we receive multiple questions on a topic, those questions may be collated together. Finally, due to the time constraints, the Q&A will remain at a relatively high level. Any intricate details, or if we run out of time to answer all your questions, additional information can be provided or discussed with you after today's meeting. As for the business of the meeting, we'll begin with Professor Andrew Coates' Chair of the Board address, followed by Leo's Director's report, and I will take you through the Q&A session of the meeting. Now, without further ado, Chair of the Board, Professor Andrew Coates. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Johnny. It's my great pleasure to meet with you here, all, albeit virtually. Johnny, if I could have the next slide. So I, as chairman of the board, I'm a heart failure cardiologist. I've been in this field for well over 30 years. And this is honestly one of the most exciting developments of a new solution for the problem of heart failure I've seen in the whole of my career. So I've been practicing. I set up Europe's largest heart failure clinic some 20 years ago. I've researched on heart failure over that whole period, and I've led and trained many of the heart failure leaders now populating European centers, and I've been president of the Heart Failure Association. But very importantly, I've also realized through work in MBA that you have to take an idea from the laboratory. If you want to make it have an impact, you have to actually work out the commercialization strategy, because it requires significant investment and resources to do all the necessary work to prove it works and it's safe. And that can take well north of $100 million, probably more like 200 or 300 for most newly developed treatments now. So you absolutely have to also understand the importance of patents, commercialization, investments, shareholders, and taking people from a variety of disciplines on the journey. And that's what we've done with ESN Cleer. Here I put down there my past history of some 30 patents and 3 biotechs I've founded that have gone on to sign very substantial deals. I believe ESN Cleer is really the most exciting of these. which is why I've been so proud to be associated and be chairman of it. I think we've also been on a journey. When I first met Leo, and great idea, he had a passion to come up with a cure for heart failure. And at the time I thought, great guy, great background, but perhaps he doesn't understand how complicated heart failure is. So we started on a journey from learning from each other. And we started from the idea that there'd be a diagnostic test to detect heart failure early, a very laudable aim, to realizing that actually that's very tricky to do because of the nature of heart failure. It's a clinical syndrome. It's not a single disease. But we had got some very exciting biomarkers. So we began to work on that and develop that further and say, well, maybe biomarkers can do more than just simply detect disease. Maybe they could identify people in a very precision way who have a particular type of disease, and in particular, people who will respond positively to a new treatment and be at less risk of side effects. And that's the holy grail of what we now call precision medicine or personalized medicine, to work out a way to identify the exact people who need a certain drug and who are highly tuned to respond to it. So we developed the biomarkers out in that direction. And very quickly, we got a lot of excitement from Big Pharma. But Leo quite rightly pointed out that they were interested in developing their own blockbuster drugs using our precision targeting mechanism. So I remember exactly the day he challenged us. He said, rather than waste our money trying to partner with people with their own drug, can't we have our own drug? Yet again, I think to say, well, actually, Leo, it's a little bit more complicated. But having thought it through, we identified some candidates, and one in particular who I'd worked on very extensively some years back, that was a true blockbuster that had just failed for one minor problem, which in retrospect, we know we could have avoided. And that was now in its native form of patent, but we could reformulate it, re-establish protective intellectual property, and redevelop it with absolute confidence it will work very well in a variety of the types or syndromes of heart failure. And that's what we've been working on building up a drug company stance where we've got that precision medicine focus on the complex series of disorders of heart failure, a really exciting drug that we can now newly instill with protective intellectual property and target for particular, what we call orphan types of heart failure, particular causes of heart failure that are simply not treatable by any other condition. And that's been a shift and a learning curve for the company, and it's grown enormously. And now it's got a very, very attractive story. And if I get up the next slide. So what I've alluded to is the fact that heart failure is important. We know that. It's one of the most prevalent disorders in the modern world. It's the leading cause for an emergency hospital admission in people aged over 65. So just think that through. In your later years, the most likely illness that will cause you to go to hospital with a life-threatening condition is heart failure. Once in hospital, it's the longest average hospitalization and the most expensive diagnosis. And it's not a nice disease to get because 50% of people, despite all our effective treatments, that still die within 5 years. But also it has extremely poor quality of life, very limited by shortness of breath, fatigue, and other symptoms. So there's still a huge amount to do, despite the fact we've been successful in one of the types of heart failure, the most common type. Next slide, which I'll come back to. So the biggest problem is that we don't detect people early enough, and we can't detect the various pathways whereby people get heart failure. We tend to wait till it's obvious, manifest, and then we do a salvage operation. We want to get in earlier and detect particular types of heart failure so we can intervene before they get to those grim statistics I showed you. And next slide, Johnny. So in the middle is a normal heart. There are 4 chambers, 2 atria, the 2 ventricles. The left, which is the one with a thicker wall in the middle, does most of the pumping that pumps blood around the body. The right sends body out to the lungs. There are 2 main types of heart failure. On the left, you see that the main left pumping chamber is enlarged. The wall is thin, and it's what we call remodeled. That's heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. We now call HFrEF. there are multiple treatments and work in that, but it's really plucking holes in the dike. You know, we can reduce mortality rates by 10 or 20%, but it still leaves very high mortality rates. And there are now about 9 treatments. So it's a bit of a problem, because if you develop a new treatment, you're on top of another 9, and you get right down the guidelines recommendation, and uptake's very slow. The different type occurs in older people, and that's where the heart muscle gets thicker and stiffer, shown here. They also have a reduced ability of the heart to pump blood around the body, but it's due to a small, stiff heart rather than a big, baggy, weak heart. And that, until very recently, had no treatments that worked at all. It's the type of heart failure you get in older age. It's not normally associated with heart attacks. It's associated more with the chronic effects of hypertension and fibrosis, inflammation, and obesity. That's called HFpEF. And we only have one drug class that's worked, and only in the last 2 years. So we believe that group of conditions, this half of heart failure, is really where the unmet need is. But, and that's a huge problem and why previous treatments haven't worked, it's not a single disorder. It's about 20 or 30 separate disorders that just look alike. And we believe that with our new drug approach, we can target several of these forms of HFpEF in a much more precision way, which has multiple advantages. We can break the problem down earlier. We can get more precise treatment. And it's also classifies as orphan disorder, which means it's not millions and millions of people, it's more hundreds of thousands, which means you get a quicker route to registration. You only need to do one clinical trial, and you can justify much higher prices because you're not threatening to blow the whole healthcare budget. Next slide. But Leo will go into that in a bit more detail. So our strategy is to take this HFpEF type, which itself can be broken down to various types. One of which, the one that we know least about, is a thing called restrictive cardiomyopathy. It's before the heart gets totally thickened, it functions as a bit stiff, and it's what we call restrictive physiology. And it has a number of rare causes or less common causes: amyloid protein, sarcoid, iron overload, eosinophilic, and there are multiple others. And each of those alone is a separate disorder, and many of them classify as an orphan disorder. If we can develop this drug with particular effects on sarcoid and iron overload, for example, then we can prove it with a single trial and get very early FDA and European regulatory, along with Australian TGA approval. And because it doesn't threaten to blow the whole healthcare budget, you can also justify much higher prices to reimburse your development costs much more quickly. So our repurposed drug, ESN TX005, is, we know, extremely likely to be effective in these conditions, but it's never been tested in these specific disorders. So we believe we can design affordable drug trials to prove it and get very early approval. And I mean within a few years, and not the conventional 10 to 15 years, starting off with a new drug for a common disease would cause. I think I'm probably handing over soon now to the next slide. Are we over to Leo? Yes, here we are. Leo, the director.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Leo de Bruin. I'm the CEO of ESN Cleer, and today I'm going to take you through some of the highlights of ESN Cleer, followed by the marketing and funding strategy, and finally the upcoming milestones. Next slide, Johnny. We're targeting a rare disease indication with our repurposed drug. It has reduced risk, cost, and time to market, which is exciting and gives us late-stage company risk with early-stage company upside. We're well on track to IPO within the next 12 months on the ASX and filing IND, investigational new drug, with the FDA in the same time frame. We have a personalized medicine opportunity and novel protected IP on the chemistry with a feasible drug ready for upscaling. We expect to receive FDA guidance within the next 6 to 7 months on the single clinical trial that Andrew was mentioning. We're still accessing the R&D tax rebate from the Australian government. Next slide, Ronnie. Our drug, ESN TX005, has proven efficacy in HFrEF, heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, with great potential in syndromes within HFpEF, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. It was superior to its competitors, but never marketed. It's highly likely to be superior within the HFpEF cluster diseases, as Andrew mentioned. The drug has a known safety profile that helps to greatly reduce the remaining time, cost, and risk towards regulatory approval. Typical timelines to get a drug approved are more than 10 years. The drug is off patent, but ESN reformulated the drug and patented the new formulation, and there are no direct competitors for these specific clusters that we're targeting. Next slide, Johnny. We have several strategic assets. One such strategy is a patented solution involving the drug, the biomarkers, and companion diagnostic device. The CDX strategy remains a compelling option, but the current focus is on the drug as a standalone asset for market approval. Next slide, Johnny. Here are some other cardiomyopathy drugs in the space, but non-competing. Most noteworthy is mavacamten, which is the first one on that list. It was a drug developed by Myocardia, and they got acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb for $13 billion once it got approval. Their phase 3 trial was only 251 patients. Next slide, Johnny. A relevant market comparative is Syncor. They were listed last year, the 7th of January, on the Nasdaq for more than $600 million, and they're trading well above $1 billion today. They hit $1 billion US valuation well before they started phase 3 trials. Next slide, Johnny. Our funding strategy includes being a portfolio company of Inocom Bioequities. It's a California-based fund raising $250 million US for its portfolio companies. We became a portfolio company through a rigorous due diligence process, which we passed late last year. Inocom is looking to be fully funded before 30 June this year, enabling a large distribution to ESN. We're also working with several brokers that are interested in a capital raise and potential ASX listing this year. Next slide, Johnny. The upcoming milestones include, firstly, an in-principle advice report, an IPA, from the ASX by the end of February this year, which is a report from the ASX to say that they will list us on the ASX if there are no significant changes from what we've submitted to them. The second is the disease-specific animal study that should be complete by the end of May, followed by the pre-IND work to complete by August, and subsequently the IND filing around September with the FDA. We then have the option to list on the ASX around the same time, with the IND approval shortly after. This enables ESN to start the single clinical trial by approximately January 24. Such a clinical trial would potentially run for around 6 months, potentially 12, to give you an idea of a time frame. Next slide, Johnny. A quick visual snapshot of the milestones that I've run you through. We're looking at a 2-year timeline from where we are today until FDA approval, with the drug, which is a very short time frame, all considered. So there's significant valuation upside over this period. We're planning to create a liquidity event within this time frame, either by a listing and or licensing and or acquisition. Thank you for your time today. I'll be handing over to Johnny. He'll step you through some other aspects of the business.
Thanks for that, Leo. Again, if anyone would like additional information, please feel free to contact us after the meeting. We will now begin our Q&A session of today's meeting. We have received a number of common questions from several shareholders. We've put the questions received into several main topics that will provide some explanations for everyone. Firstly, the audit report's going concern section. The audit report had included the going concern on page 11, quote, "The financial statements have been prepared on the going concern basis, which contemplates continuity of normal business activities and the realization of assets and discharge of liabilities in the normal course of business." Hayley, could you please explain a little on the going concern section of an audit report?
Yep, can do, Johnny. Thank you.
Thanks.
So yeah, as we outlined in the audit report and in the notes, we raised a material uncertainty in relation to the going concern assumption. So that was based on the indicators we noted as part of our audit. So the indicators that we considered were the loss of the company. So for the year, that was 827,000, cash operating outflows of 789,000, and a cash balance at year end of $72,000. So what the indicators present to us is that there may not be enough cash reserves for the business if the operating cash outflows were to remain the same. So given the company is in the pre-revenue generating stage, it's just heavily reliant on the cash reserves at that point in time. So the mitigating factors we considered from discussion with the directors was that there was a post-year-end capital raise to help assist with the outgoing cash flow. There's future intentions to raise more capital, which will assist with the cash outflows, and the fact that the company could reduce costs further if need be as well. So all of these considerations, mitigating factors to support the going concern assumption. Yeah, if there's any more you want me to outline there, please let me know.
No worries, Haley. Thanks for that. Any additional details we can provide to any shareholders if they require. And as mentioned in the director's report today, we have made significant progress to mitigate a lot of the financial risks and to enable continuous advancement for our milestones and projected achievements and the pathway ahead of us. I'd also like to point out a few key notes on some of the details of the FY22 financial report. Firstly, as you see on the revenue in the report, it is merely from the R&D tax rebate received from the Australian government for the financial year. This is the rebate we received from the Australian government for R&D expenses in Australia. So for example, suppliers based in Australia. We are currently also working on accessing the Australian government's international findings, which means that we can access funding from the government for expenses overseas as well for the next several years. This is most important to us as there will be an increase in development work carried out overseas. Secondly, the loss of FY22 has been significantly lower than the previous year, as the majority of the expense in the year before FY21 was the share-based payments expense, which was the ESOP exercise back then. While the expense was a non-cash expense, it was recorded as an expense that contributes to the loss on the books. Lastly, as Haley had mentioned briefly just then, the cash and cash equivalents was reported at the end of the financial year being relatively low. However, as disclosed and mentioned in the report, additional capital was raised right after the end of the financial year. Thus, the business has adequate cash flow to carry out its operations towards the milestones and build assets and value to the business, which leads to investor exit opportunities. As mentioned by Leo, we are on track for an IPO listing. Throughout the course of hitting the milestones coming up, these can also lead to possible M&A opportunities as commonly seen in the industry. These are the possible opportunities coming up for our investors to achieve a good return on investment result. And of course, the expected continuous value growth thereafter along the development and commercialization pathway, such as the ongoing out-licensing revenue opportunities that we have. So these are the main points that I've gathered also throughout the discussions today. We have answered most of the questions that we have received. And looking at the Q&A box, we do not have any questions at this very moment, which is okay. What we'll do is I will digitize this recording and share the video to everybody, which you can also, everybody can consume and get a good understanding. And if any other questions or any information are required by anybody, feel free to email us and let us know, and we'll share any additional details with everybody. And this concludes our AGM for FY 2022. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and please look out for our progress updates, emails in the coming months as well. Thank you for all the shareholders' support throughout the years. And of course, thanks to the board and special guest Haley for joining us today. And please stay well and be safe. Thank you and bye for now. The meeting is now closed. Thank you so much, everybody.